billion. Our anchor for this address is Mr. V.K. Mathews, founder and executive chairman, IBS Software, and a Thai Charter member. Mr. Mathews, over to you.
Thank you, Rangam. Once again, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are, friends. Welcome to this keynote session by Nicolas Brusson of BlaBlaCar. It's a pleasure and privilege for me to moderate this session where Nicolas will share his extensive entrepreneurial experience and will talk more about BlaBlaCar, which is, as you might be knowing, world's leading carpool platform. Millions of drivers from several countries, tens of countries, use this platform. BlaBlaCar, as I understand, makes travel more social, economical, and also eco-friendly for its members. Ladies and gentlemen, we are just to take a few minutes to set the context. It's a very opportune moment for a person like Nicolas to talk to us because we are in very, very extraordinary situation the world is going through. The disease threat is still continuing with over 74 million cases and about 1.7 million deaths at about 2.3% death rate and 15 plus countries having a million more cases. The economy has shrunk drastically and is shrinking through this year to 2020, 4 to 5% drop in 2020, and hopefully will recover through next year and through pre-crisis level. Sharp decline in activities in all sectors. Government finances remain very weakened. Business spending is reducing. The good news is that the economic model is still not broken. That means the people still want products and services, and they always want a good deal, means competition. So that is the good news, but there are lasting scars on the economy. Travel industry, where BlaBlaCar is also playing, is one of the hardest hit of the 3 trillion, the 10 trillion economy. There's a dip of about 30%, which means about 3 trillion. And we should be losing about 120 million jobs, direct jobs. And aviation industry that I specialize will drop by about 66% this year. And a recovery to pre-crisis level is going to take up until 2023, 2024. And what we are seeing, ladies and gentlemen, is a great acceleration of trends through this period. Companies which did very well until COVID time has done even better during COVID period, whereas the bottom quintile of companies did as worse. 2 years worth of digital transformation in 2 months. Online deliveries in the month of July, August has exceeded that of last 1 decade. Telemedicine in 15 days greater than past 2 years. A quarter has become a new year for us. And the major lessons for us, and before I hand over to Nicolas, is that every company is becoming a technology company. In other words, every enterprise is trying to become a digitally enabled enterprise. Agility is key. However, we also have seen that the companies which tide over this crisis are stable companies. So we have to rhyme agility with stability. When we talk about agility, we are talking about fast, nimble, and adaptive. And when we talk about stable organizations, what I mean is resilient, reliable, and efficient companies. Yeah, and that's what we want. Now, just a few words about Nicolas Brusson, and then I will hand over to him to share his experience. So Nicolas Brusson is the co-founder and CEO of BlaBlaCar. Prior to becoming the CEO, prior to the CEO role, he oversaw BlaBlaCar's global operations and international as Chief Operating Officer. He led the company's corporate development. He oversaw 8 acquisitions, expansion to 20 markets, and 3 successive rounds of fundraising. Nicolas is a regular speaker at leading international conferences and in the media, where he comments on European startup scene, innovative growth, strategies, and mobility. Prior to BlaBlaCar in 2011, Nicolas worked for several startups in Silicon Valley during the dot-com boom before moving on to executive roles and investor roles, including spending time as a venture capitalist at Amadeus Capital Partners in London. Nicolas holds an MBA from INSEAD, a master's in optics, and a master in applied physics from Paris University. So Nicolas, over to you. And this is the most premier, the most important event which Thai Kerala holds. And this is attended by, it's the most premier entrepreneurship program in the state. Over to you to share your experiences and information which people can all, and the people in the audience are entrepreneurs as well as aspiring entrepreneurs. Yeah, over to you, Nicolas.
Hello, well, thank you for the introduction. I hope technically you can hear me and you can see the slides I'm presenting. Is that all good?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you.
Yes.
So thank you. Just making sure it worked from that standpoint. So what I'll try to do during the next half hour or slightly more than half hour is first of all give you a quick presentation about what we do, talking about the company and the adventure around BlaBlaCar. But I'll try to focus on the entrepreneurship journey and share with you. If I manage to go through all the slides, but I'll try to share with you 5 learnings, 5 things that I guess I've learned, or we've learned as founders of BlaBlaCar, creating a company and growing a company, and that could be useful for any startuper and future entrepreneurs. So I'll try to save some time on those 5 learnings and give you some examples of what that meant for BlaBlaCar. So before I get to that, just maybe a reminder for some, or just an introduction for many people of what's BlaBlaCar and where do we operate. So we've really become over the years what you could call a go-to marketplace for shared travel, right? So it's really a place where travelers would go either to save money when they have a car with empty seats, or simply to book a trip to travel from A to B. So it's really based on that notion of community, and we've grown a community of 90 million members. In fact, we should early next year be at 100 million members, which obviously is going to be a big milestone for us, having created that massive community. And I would say in normal times, we transport about 25 million travelers per quarter. Obviously, 2020 has been a very special year. Maybe I'll talk a bit about that, where we had to adjust with pretty big ups and downs. We have fundamentally 3 brands. BlaBlaCar is by far the biggest and the most known across the world, which is the long distance carpooling one. So essentially it's the place where casual drivers can share their trip when they drive around the country. And then passengers can book those empty seats, just like they would book a seat in a plane or a train or in a bus. We also have BlaBlaBus, mostly operating in Europe. So those are long distance coach. It's also a marketplace model. So we work with partners, and essentially BlaBlaBus and BlaBlaCar are just platforms where essentially passengers meet drivers, whether it's professional bus drivers or casual car drivers. And more recently, we introduced, only in France this time, a product called Bla Bla Lines, which is essentially a commuting product. So really trying to crack carpooling applied to your daily commute when you go to work, which is by far the biggest segment where we use our car today. So that's pretty much how it's constructed. So BlaBlaCar is really the macro platform gathering all these different elements. In Europe, as I said, we have a mix of carpooling, long distance, and commuting. We have a controlled bus offer with branded buses that we operate through a fleet of partner. And then outside of Europe, we also have BlaBlaCar, long distance carpooling. And we do also aggregate buses, but very much like an open marketplace. So essentially, we do that in countries like Russia, Ukraine, Brazil, and we want to expand that on a global scale. And essentially, it's just building technology to enable any bus transporter, any bus carrier to connect to BlaBlaCar and start selling their seat onto the platform. So I guess the key word here, we've really designed that to be the two keywords. We've really designed that to be a platform, and we designed that to be also a community where people sign up, create a profile, and we create trust either with partners or between people. Now, I often show that number, which has a bit of a European bias, but it's still very interesting because we tend to forget that. Today, 76% of trips of 100 to 800 kilometers are actually done by car. And that's something that, interestingly, specifically when you go to Europe, people don't even realize. Like if you go to France or you go to Germany and you ask a random French person or German person, how do people travel typically between cities? They would tend to think rail, train, because we have a pretty good train system. That's true. But in fact, the number of passengers traveling by train in countries like France or Germany is dwarfed by the number of people traveling by car on those distances. And obviously the problem, which is a macro problem we have not solved yet, those cars are empty, right? So if you look at the car occupancy of those vehicles, it tends to be around 1.5, depending on the countries, but essentially, largely the cars are empty, which means if you think of that from I would say a positive standpoint, obviously from a negative standpoint, it has like a massive negative economic and environmental impact. But if you think of that from a, I would say, more entrepreneurial, positive mindset, that's the biggest inventory of seats in the world right there, right? Suddenly you have like billions of empty seats in cars traveling between cities, not being constrained by train station or bus station that can go anywhere, that could be monetized. And essentially, if we make them available for people to book, not only the driver could save money, you could ultimately reduce the number of cars on the road, reduce the emission, and you would have like a massive environmental and economic impact. So we're probably not going to crack that problem alone, but that's probably one of the problems of our generation, by the way, because if you look at that from a CO2 emission standpoint, the car dominates. Like your car usage is actually one of, there are a few others, but it's one of the big pillar of CO2 emissions. So we got to reinvent the car. And that's probably going to be, for the next 20, 30 years, we will see in many ways, actually, the reinvention of the car. From a technology standpoint, we talk about electric, we talk about autonomous, but also from a behavioral usage point of view, I think it's going to be increasingly shared. So that's just illustrating what I was describing. So in Europe, on these long distances, so from 100 to 800 kilometers, you are typically on average at 1.9 people per car. If you look at our community, it's 3.9 people per car. So it's a massive improvement on the efficiency and the usage of the car. And the other thing that's fascinating when you start thinking and building a transport network around private cars that go anywhere, you realize, and that's what this map actually is showing, you realize that you are not constrained by bus station or train station or airports, right? Cars can go anywhere, essentially. Anywhere you have a road. So what I'm showing here is the number of pickup and drop off within, I think it's like a week or a month time period on a map of Europe plus Russia and Turkey, in a pretty wide area. And you can see like the incredible density, specifically in Western Europe, where we have the biggest community, the incredible density of pickup and drop off. So in France alone, we have 20,000 meeting points for BlaBlaCar. So we have like an extremely dense mapping of the country, which means your BlaBlaCar can pretty much take you from any village to any village or any part of the suburb to any part to another city suburb, which is far superior from a point-to-point standpoint. than any of the means of transport. And by the way, that's why we often prefer the car, right? It's not for any other reason than the fact that it goes from your garage to the ski resort or the beach or the hotel you want to go to. Obviously, I talked quite a bit about that, and that's one of the things that animates us and the team. It's the positive environmental impact of that transformation of the car into a shared vehicle over time. So internally, we tend to call that zero empty seats as a project. So that's our obsession. Our obsession is, can we build that platform and that trusted community so that essentially we make use of any of these seats? Again, both from an environmental point of view to reduce CO2 emission and an economic point of view so that we can actually monetize those seats for the drivers. So to give you a sense of scale, right now, the whole global operation of BlaBlaCar is saving something around 1.6 million tons of CO2 every year. To give you a sense of what it represents, that's essentially like 1 year of emission of all the cars in Paris, right? So it could be the same as essentially having no car whatsoever in the city and surrounding of Paris. So that's significant. At the scale of the planet, that's still very tiny. So we still have like a long way essentially before we have like the type of environmental impact that would matter. But it's still like a pretty impressive start compared to where we were 10 years ago, when people even thought that the idea of sharing a private car was crazy, right? And today we have like 100 million people, close to 100 million people actually doing it in 22 countries. Another interesting thing that I would say we anticipated, but not to that extent, is the incredible experience actually people have on BlaBlaCar, meaning that with BlaBlaCar you end up connecting with people you were sort of not supposed to meet, right? So you have this very strong, enriching experience. And when we surveyed the community, we realized that the vast majority of people say, well, when I used BlaBlaCar, it was an enriching experience. So 87% of people. And if you step back a bit and you think, well, actually, if you take BlaBlaCar as a transport network, it's pretty amazing that 87% say it's an enriching experience. That you would never say that when you take a train or a flight. You would not say like, well, it was an enriching experience to take Ryanair or to take like a train between Paris and Brussels. It was just it was very functional. So there is something fundamentally emotional in the fact that people are sharing. They feel part of a broader mission, and it creates those social connections, which is, by the way, the root of the name, right? So that's why we decided to have this funny, funky name, BlaBlaCar. It's because what happens when you put 2, 3, 4 strangers in a car? Well, they talk, which is not the case actually with your neighbor on a plane or a train. But in a car, because there is this notion of private space, people engage and they have this very enriching experience. So I have a bit more here on CO2 impact, just to give a sense essentially for people of what that means in terms of like you're going from using your car alone to sharing your car. So it has like a pretty strong environmental impact. It's also here to explain why we also pushing buses on the platform, at least from a philosophical point of view. Buses are also part of the solution to some extent, right? I mean, you can think of buses as just big cars to some extent. So obviously they're constrained by bus stations and they don't have the same fluidity as cars. But fundamentally, we thought for our community, it made sense to combine the very granular people-powered car network with a bus aggregator network. And over time, even probably aggregate trains. So we want to aggregate any means of transport that's part of the solution of shared travel, or at least shared travel on the ground, and that goes toward like reducing CO2 emission and traveling in a more reasonable and sustainable manner. So that's where we are. That's BlaBlaCar. I'm happy to answer some questions. I wanted to get into 4 or 5 learnings of the last 10 years. So now I'm really going to talk more about the entrepreneurial and CEO experience. So one thing that has been driving me personally, actually, for the last 10 years with BlaBlaCar is this sentence, actually, that I've heard, in fact, from Vinod Khosla, who is the founder of Sun Microsystem in the US, actually, and I believe was, in fact, even born in India and moved to the US, actually, to become an entrepreneur. And when he joined Kleiner Perkins Green Fund, and I think it was back in probably 2006, 2007, he was talking about this environmental problem, and he said, like, well, now we need to find businesses that really have scalable solution, because the scale of the problem of global warming and that we'll be facing in the next 10, 20, 30 years is so big that if it doesn't scale, it doesn't matter. And we really thought of that for BlaBlaCar, and we thought, like, it's great if we manage to convince, like, thousands of people to share their car and to do some sort of like improved hitchhiking project, but that's not the point, because if we only do that and it only appeals to a small subset, a small niche of the population, it won't scale and it won't matter, right? In terms of like business size, obviously, but also in terms of solving like a more global problem. So I think it was one of the things we kept in mind as we grew the business, is we always try to find solutions that we can easily replicate. And the good news in that is that's what a lot of new technologies are about, right? If you look at the new technologies we've been able to leverage, whether it's like smartphone and internet connections, obviously, and social networks, all these things scaled extremely fast. So the way, like scaling trust has been a complicated issue. Like, how do you create trust very quickly over a community of 100 million people? And to some extent, like all sort of technology in terms of like ID check at scale, having like rating between users at scale, the growth of social network actually in the early phase of BlaBlaCar, all of that helped us essentially scale dramatically. So now talking about the scaling of the business, we had 3 phases essentially in this sort of like scaling of BlaBlaCar. I would say one part from 2006 to 2011 was very much the garage phase of BlaBlaCar. It was also the phase of disbelief. So when from 2006 to essentially 2010, it was almost impossible for us to raise money. It was in the middle, 2008, 2009 of the financial crisis. And we had to prove the model, right? So we had to prove that actually some people do it, they do it repeatedly. So it was sort of again, like the garage phase. Then we had like a first massive scaling phase, which was, okay, now we demonstrated the use case. We believe we have a product. We've built that product to be scalable, to be up, again, a community and a platform. And the 2 key words, essentially from 2012 to 2016, that we were repeating all the time to the company was global mobile. And that's what we've done. So we took this good product that people loved and came to for free. Essentially, we were not doing any marketing in the early days. We were not spending any money. We took it to a global scale, and we moved everything, which was initially desktop, by the way. We started in 2006, 7, 8 on a desktop and not on a mobile. I mean, the iPhone just came out in 2007. And we went into launching as many countries as possible, raising fund, and doing all of that on, or most of that on mobile. So that's what we've done. That's how we get to 22 countries. That's how we get to launch India about 3 years ago, a bit more than 3 years ago. That's how we launched countries like Brazil and Mexico and Turkey and Russia and Ukraine outside of Europe. So we have like a pretty broad geo spectrum. And then in 2017, we thought, okay, what's next? I mean, obviously it was still growing. Today India is still growing like extremely well, even in the time of COVID, actually. But we thought, like, okay, what's the next level of growth for the next 5 to 10 years? Is it going to be to add more countries? or add more product. And we realized in 17 that the next way to scale was actually adding more product. So we decided to add buses to the platform, and that's why we acquired a company called WeBus in France. That's why we acquired a company like Bus4 in Russia. And the point is to become this platform where people can find not just carpooling, but also buses and train. And the reason we do that is, I mean, obviously to multiply and scale the business and the usage, but also because we believe if the platform becomes a platform for everything, where essentially people can book pretty much anything there is, whether it's like a train or bus or a car, actually we're going to see lots of cross usage, from people that never thought of doing carpooling will start doing carpooling, or people who drive their car and share their car will think of actually sometime becoming a passenger in another mode of transport. So essentially you cross-pollinate the community, and you should be able, in fact, to grow carpooling by offering other things, which seems counterintuitive, but essentially the mass of the community is increasing, and we see lots of cross usage between mode of transport. So that gives you a sense of what I was describing in terms of phasing. You can see that the 2006 to 2011 was actually a long road, and that's probably something to keep in mind for many entrepreneurs. It doesn't always come for free, or it doesn't always come fast. Very often it's a long uphill battle. So for us, it was like many years of I would say headwind, with people, naysayers, and people not believing that people would share their car, and then we had like the sort of like 6-7 years after that have been exponential growth, and we're still seeing pretty strong growth toward 100 million actually in Q1 of next year. I talked about trust. I mean, trust was something we scaled also through ratings and technology. So today we have like tens of millions of ratings between people. We have like millions and millions of ID checks and bank account verification and so on. So essentially, like we cemented again through technology levers massive trust within users, and that was one of the key ingredients of growth. Actually, it was the fact that you don't share a car with a stranger. You share a car with someone that's been vetted by the rest of the community over time. So it was one of the elements of growth that was critical. I'll probably skip the business model and the brand aspect, but maybe just very quickly on the brand. I mean, you like we started with a brand that probably you can't even pronounce, which means carpooling in French. We realized pretty quickly that it was great for SEO because it was a descriptor, but obviously non-scalable. And we took the wild bet, I guess, to take like a funky name, right? Something that's in fact memorable, but a bit funky. And that worked. I mean, today it's one of the most valued brand actually in transport in several countries. It's in the top 3 actually in several countries. So it was a big bet we took early on, and that we don't regret. Going away from being like a dull descriptor, which again, when you start, is quite useful because you get free traffic because your name is a descriptor, but it doesn't work moving forward. So you can see it's just illustrating what I was describing before, talking about like speed of scaling. So internationally, we went from 1 experiment in 1 country and to 22 countries in about 5 years, right? So it was really from 2009, 2010 to 2016, we opened 22 countries. So what's linked to that, and maybe learning number 2, I guess we add as entrepreneurs is always fundraise. And you'd be surprised maybe to hear that we never in the entire story of BlaBlaCar used a banker or someone to fundraise for us. So essentially, we've always been in contact with investors, always sort of like telling our story, and to some extent, always or never, depending on how you want to see it, fundraising. And to me, the key learning was, it's very important to invest some time, I guess, with people that need to believe in your business and will finance your business, and don't come for them at the last minute for money. It tends to be, I mean, sometimes it works, but it tends to be like a more painful experience. It tends to be harder for you, and you or the investor tend to make a mistake. It's like getting married in 1 month or 2 months or 3 months. I found it a lot better when you build relationship, when you ask for advice. And I often say that, like, if you want money, ask for advice. If you want an advice, ask for money. And that's true. And that's very, very much true. So don't think of, when I'm running out of money, I'll go fundraise. Keep fundraising all the time. Keep telling your story all the time to investors. And that works a lot better because investors tend to prefer to have, like, to see a movie essentially as opposed to a picture. So when you go to an investor for the first time and you say, like, here's where I am, here's what I want to build, they see a picture. If you've been building a relationship over 1, 2, 3 years, they start to trust you. They see a movie taking place, and either they like or they don't like the movie, but at least they know what they get into. So you can see on the slide the fundraising history of the company. Every fundraising was tagged to a purpose, whether it was like, European expansion, global expansion. The last two are very much linked, in fact, to going multimodal, and we call that strategic investment that was linked also to becoming multimodal. Every time, I think it's important to say that, we had been talking to these investors for at least 2 years. Not about investing, just building the relationship, telling the story, getting the advice. Many of them connected us. And we've been lucky enough that any of those investors, it was a conscious choice. So it was not like a default choice driven by, okay, we get one willing to sign a check. It was always the product of a relationship, and it makes obviously the relationship in tough times. Remember that, like, as an entrepreneur, you probably go through tougher time. However great the business, however great the idea, you probably go through tough time. I mean, no businesses don't go through a tough time in 10 or 20 years. And that's when you test the relationship. So learning number 3, and I think this one, a year like 2020 is a good reminder of that. The only constant when you do a startup or entrepreneurial adventure is change. Like, things are changing all the time. Sometimes because you want to change them, because you need to change them, but frankly, sometimes because you have external events, just like COVID, that force you to change. And in 2020, I can tell you that our business plan has been completely changed. I mean, like many companies, and companies that are culturally not in a that have been used to sort of like a very deterministic pattern internally have been challenged. I think companies that culturally were used to change and externalities and moving fast were probably less challenged. Maybe the P&L, maybe the business was challenged, but the culture was maybe less challenged. So that's something we've built in actually at BlaBlaCar, is that we meant to evolve. Nothing is taken for granted. And that's also why we keep on innovating. So I'll show a couple of examples of that, but we launched the short distance commuting product 2 years ago. And that was almost like a product that was meant to disrupt ourselves, because we thought essentially if we don't do a short distance commuting carpooling product, someone else will, and we might might actually build a better product for a higher frequency use case and disrupt us. So that's something that we sort of like force change on ourselves. So that's really an internal change. Same thing on buses. Like, we were not forced to do that. But we realize that if we want to evangelize a larger population, we need to launch buses. So we keep on trying stuff. By the way, we sometimes try things that don't work, and that's okay. And if they don't work, we have this value called fail, learn, succeed, and we try to not fail fast in a sense of not do things properly, but at least like acknowledge that something has failed and pivot pretty quickly. So we keep on innovating. We acquired a bus company in Russia to accelerate our development. Learning number 4, probably the most important for any entrepreneur when you start your company. Your culture and the culture of the company is going to be your compass. And again, like in tough times, when you have external events like COVID disrupting your business, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively, you're going to be testing the culture of your company. And that's something that, as entrepreneurs, you build early on or you neglect early on, right? So you need to be very careful with that, because if you neglect it early on, it will backfire eventually. If you build it early on, that's going to grow and you need to water it all the time. And that's going to be probably one of your key strengths. So I think it was the CEO of Microsoft that said, like, culture eats strategy for breakfast or something like that. And it's very true. It's very, very true. Like if you have a strong culture, you'll adapt, you'll change, you'll evolve, you'll try new things. If you don't, you'll struggle. So that's something.
Nicolas, in the interest, it's very, very interesting. I wish we had more time, but we have some questions flowing in. So
so maybe we can pause there. I had like another 2, but I can actually pause there. I think I said most of it on the 4th one.
We have now 7 minutes left.
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah. So may I ask you some questions, or would you like to complete this slide? And
No. Go ahead, and I can jump to
very, very interesting. Yeah, Nicolas, extremely interesting. I'm just repeating the 4 lessons, 4 learnings that you mentioned. If it doesn't scale, it doesn't matter. Always fundraise before you need the money, and only constant is change, which COVID is even teaching us better. And culture is the most important. And learning for keep your eyes on the right indicators. Yes.
But here you have the 5th one. I'm sure but that's let's jump into questions. I think that's very more interesting.
Yes. So the first question: do you compete? How do you compete with Uber and Ola? And are they truly a competition for BlaBlaCars?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the short answer is we don't actually. So we're not competitors in a sense that Uber and Ola are really about building like an on-demand product within the city for pretty short distances. So most people know the product. Essentially, you press a button, a driver is coming and driving you for 1, 2, 3, 10, 20 miles maybe. And dropping you off where you want. So it's ride hailing, which is not what we do. What we do tends to be like longer distances. So people going 50 kilometer to maybe 1,000 kilometer, and it's really like a private owner. So it's like a student, a math teacher, an engineer, whatever, driving his or her car between 2 places with 2 or 3 empty seats. So it's more like maybe. To use well-known brands that people would recognize, it's more like Airbnb applied to your car, right? So it's like what you would do with your apartment on Airbnb. Like you're not there for a weekend, you're not there maybe for a longer period of time, and you rent your apartment or a room in your apartment on Airbnb. So interestingly, like from a business dynamic point of view, from building like a platform where apartment owners or homeowners can actually make money by renting the private space for the most part. That's the same thing with cars on BlaBlaCar. So we don't compete because, again, different business model. Drivers are not professional; they're just casual people. So it's really a C2C, not a B2C marketplace. So it's a question we get very, very often, but I would say we've never lost a customer to Uber and Ola, and they never lost probably a customer to us.
Nicolas, did you face this issue? Particularly, I was looking at the developing world and probably even underdeveloped world, when does safety come in the way of scaling this business, particularly in certain markets? And how do you address that?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, I would say on the carpooling segment, obviously, when you start aggregating buses and other more traditional mean of transport, it's, that question is not there. But when we build and we build carpooling, I often describe it this way: like, we're not really building a transport network because we don't decide where drivers go. They just go and tell us where they want to go. What we're building is a trust network. So essentially, like, everything we've built was around trust and safety, right? So it was about how do we make sure that anyone engaging onto BlaBlaCar is fully signed up. So it's you cannot be anonymous on BlaBlaCar, and so you need to sign up. You need to give us a mobile phone number. We check it, and then over time we check your ID. So now we have some ID checks verification. Over time, we check your license plate of your car, so we can actually have a link to your car license plate. We as we introduce like full online payout for drivers, which is not yet in countries like India. Well, as we do that, we have a bank account on the driver's side.
So the drivers, the members, do they get a score which increasingly increases and things like that?
Yeah, exactly. So the thing to keep in mind is, for us, there is not like a driver population and a passenger population. We see that, that lots of people do both. So you are a member of that community.
Yeah.
And people, so we do two things, like people rate each other. So as a passenger or the driver, you always get a rating. So again, like we have tens of millions of those. So you can see when you book a BlaBlaCar, you can barely see what the previous like 5, 10, 20, 100 people have said about that driver or that passenger when you are a driver accepting or refusing a passenger in your car. So you have like all this information.
This one more important question: how do you charge? What's your pricing model? So, for instance, I'm traveling. Say it's a 300 kilometers journey, driver and two fellow passengers journey.
Yeah. So today. So you have two dimensions here. You have like how do we price the trip, and then how do we make money as a platform. So the way we price the trip today is very much driver led. I mean, just like any listing, so the driver would say, "Hey, I'm driving from A to B, and I would like $20 or whatever for per seat on that segment." After that, though, so it has evolved quite a bit over the last couple of years. Essentially, what we do is once we understand you're going from A to B, we can match you with like any subsegment of that trip with passengers doing whatever, like C to D or whatever, I mean something else within that A to B, and we price it. So over time, actually, what we get from drivers is just an intent. They tell us like, I'm good. That's my starting point. That's my end point. And that's like my average price on that entire segment I'd like to get to see. And then we work with that and we try to find passengers along the way. So sometimes it might be exactly what you want, but sometimes it might be a sub-segment of what you want, and the price might be higher or lower. So we optimize essentially in space and price to find passengers. And then as a business model, we take, which is very much like Uber, Ola, or Airbnb, it's like a typical, I would say, transactional marketplace model, where over time we end up taking a fee, a take rate on that transaction.
Yeah. Thank you so much. There are several other questions coming from the audience, as well as in my mind also recurring. Extremely interesting business model and very relevant as well. And I'm quite sure this will be phenomenally value-adding, eco-friendly, economic, and social, and enjoying a journey rather than just undertaking a journey, and enjoying the experience. All of them are the positives. And I wish you, and I wish BlaBlaCar all the very best. Let it scale throughout the world.